All right, well, welcome everybody. This is our 5th Mission Control webinar. This is an ongoing series to show you how you, as a test sponsor, can take control of the exam development process so you can create or scale up a certification program and build new high-quality exams more quickly wherever you are in that process. If you missed any of our earlier sessions on job task analyses, item writing and review, beta testing, or standard setting, you can find those recordings on our website or just reach out to us. My name is Andrea Brown. I'm the Chief Marketing Officer for Certiverse, and I'm here today with our Chief Psychometrician, Dr. Alan Mead, and we will be talking about his, well, I won't say his favorite thing, but his favorite topic, let's say that. And our series is presented by Certiverse. If you are not familiar, we are an all-in-one, end-to-end online exam development and delivery platform. Our award-winning technology is designed to make every step of creating a test more efficient, more inclusive, less costly, and easier on the environment. We'd love to tell you more about that. And so just let us know after the webinar or visit certiverse.com to schedule some time to talk. Our goal is to keep this presentation to half an hour, and we got a lot of ground to cover. So we're going to ask that you put any questions you may have in the Q&A section, either directed toward everyone, you can kind of pick that from the dropdown, or just the host and panelists if you'd rather be anonymous. And then we'll address those at the end of the session. And so with that, let's get started. Alan, could you introduce yourself and tell our audience a little bit about your background?
Sure. Hi, everyone. So my name is Alan Mead, and I'm the Chief Psychometrician at the Certiverse, and I'm trained as an industrial psychologist, so I've done a lot of different things, but Psychometrics has been at the core of most of the things that I've been doing, and so this is, kind of my favorite topic. And one danger is that I might talk about this topic like a psychometrician, and be kind of academic or technical. And so one of my goals is not to do too much of that, and to connect what I'm talking about psychometrics to how we create better exams and the steps that we do. I work for Certiverse. One of my other goals is to talk about ways that we can leverage technology to improve the productivity of psychometricians. I don't think that Certiverse or any other platform is going to make psychometricians go away altogether. But the way that technology works is we can make one psychometrician more productive, able to focus on more exams or and improve the process. And that is one of the things that Certiverse does. And I don't think there's anything specific to Certiverse that I'll talk about. That is to say, I think that any platform could potentially do this, or you could hire a psychometrician to do it. But we'll talk about some things. I'll use some examples from Certiverse. So our agenda is that I'll talk a little bit about psychometrics in abstract. Then I'll connect psychometrics to the test development process and talk about how it specifically affects the steps that you use. And then I'll try and make some comments that connect psychometrics to the big picture, and we'll take your questions. So psychometrics is the science of measurement, and especially the measurement of unobservable latent constructs like knowledge and skills and abilities and other characteristics. So, we all have a lot of experience measuring physical things like height or the length of a board or something like that. But when we measure psychological constructs like the knowledge that a candidate has about a topic, that's a little bit different. And we need a way to construct a ruler that measures their degree of knowledge. And test development is the process of creating that ruler. And psychometrics is the art and science of providing guidance in creating that ruler. And then it's also a methodology that provides a way to audit that ruler and determine that the ruler is a good ruler, since it's a thing that we can't see. We can't see the measurement process. So I thought that rather than talking more about psychometrics directly, I would talk about why exams work. So we have a candidate and we have a half hour or an hour or 2 hours of their time. We have to do something. And our goal is to predict, what their knowledge of an area is or something like that. And the question is, how do we structure that time so that we maximize the information that we gain about what they do? And exams are a very efficient way of finding out what a person's knowledge is. And the question is, well, what do you have to do in that half hour or 90 minutes that allows you to make the best predictions of a person. And I think there are 5 specific things that cause exams to work. And the first is a careful choice of relevant content. So, that process where you're trying to find out information about the candidate could go a lot of different ways. You've seen interviews or heard about interviews where the interviewer asks somebody something like, if you were a color, what color would you be? And they like that question because it allows the person to talk about things and they can make inferences. But the psychometric approach is to pick topics that are relevant. So the psychometric approach to an interview, for example, would be to decide what you want to measure, what the KSAs are that you want to measure, and then to ask questions that are designed to address that. And in an exam, we would decide what the domain is, and we would write questions, or if it's performance tasks, we would create performance tasks that are relevant to that. And then the second thing is performance replication. So if you had a basketball game where the 2 teams came in and they each took 1 shot on basket and then you declared a winner, that wouldn't be a very exciting basketball game. And moreover, it wouldn't be an accurate reflection of the acumen of the 2 teams. I'm not a big sports fan, but every sports event that I'm aware of has repeated segments. Like baseball has 9 innings, unless there's a tie, then there's more. Or hockey has 3 periods. So the replication of performance over repeated attempts is an important element to assessing the person's underlying knowledge or skill or what have you accurately. And then it's also important to be objective. I talked about interviews. This isn't about interviews, but primarily that's because interviews are very expensive to have a person do the interviewing. The problem with interviews is that they're not very objective, and tests represent a more not only a cheaper but a more objective way of quantifying the degree of knowledge or skills that a person has. And then another huge thing is that tests of any sort are standardized. So we don't ask one person one question, another person a different question, or if we do, we're very careful that both of those questions are alternate forms of each other, that every person is evaluating the same number and the same type of questions, maybe the same question. If you have 2 forms of exams, that you have a Form A and a Form B for retesting or for exam security purposes, one of the things that psychometricians spend a lot of time worrying about is that those 2 forms are equivalent, so that a person who comes and takes your exam has a standardized experience, that they get the same experience for both those exams. And of course, it's quantified. So for example, if you have a test score of 10 and somebody else has a test score of 11, clearly 11 is higher. But we can even quantify the degree of error associated with the test score, so that we know, and probably in most tests, 10 and 11 are not significantly different. There's a margin of error around the scores, and that would probably be larger than a single score point for most exams. So this is the reason why tests work, if you will. And psychometrics is a recipe for creating effective measures. So if you follow the psychometric steps, you're likely to end up with an effective tool that is valid. And validity here means that the ruler that you create that measures a person's knowledge or their skills or what have you is one that produces results that are useful for a purpose. They're useful for deciding somebody has mastered an area, or they're useful for deciding whether somebody should have passed a class or what have you. And the results will be reliable. They will be as free from error and have as small a margin of error in the exam scores as is possible. And because of these things, that would be more defensible, which is, for some exams less important, and for some exams it's very important. So the next set of slides connect psychometric practices with specific aspects of test development. So I took those 5 reasons why testing works and I matrixed it with the steps in test development. So we could take a look at how each step contributes to a test being effective. So starting off with some sort of job analysis or role analysis or task analysis, that's a way of deciding exactly what content should be on your exam. And a significant aspect of that is ensuring that your exam is covering relative content, and that you are at the end of that analyzing the degree of importance for each element and that you have an appropriate balance of those things. And that this process of doing a job analysis is inherently subjective. You're asking subject matter experts their view. And so the role of job analysis as a methodology is to make that subjective process as objective, as transparent, as replicable as possible. And the output of the job analysis would feed into a blueprint. So the blueprint is literally a blueprint for creating forms. It should have weights associated with each of the topics. It should also specify anything else. If you have case studies, in every exam should have 2 case studies, that should be part of the blueprint. And so definitely it is key to ensuring that the content is relevant, and to standardizing the different forms, that the degree to which you create a form that adheres to a blueprint, you would assume that it has content validity, and that different forms therefore have the same degree of content validity. And the numeric aspects of the weight is important. If the blueprint says that there should be 5 items, then there should be exactly 5 items for the most part. And the next step is to create item writing assignments in proportion to the weights of the blueprint, and then to write the items. And this step is probably, of all of these steps are important. They're kind of like links in a chain, but item writing has the special, that's the point where you write the exam. And so it's important. It's important that if item writing is not successful, then there is no way to make the exam better other than additional development work, writing more items. So it's a critical step. And obviously you adhere to the item writing assignment should be targeted on a topic, and that ensures that you're covering relevant material. And this is the point where you can create performance repetition. You can ensure that you have an adequate number of items to cover the topic according to what the blueprint says. Some topics have only a single item, but there's many times that there's several items, and this is the opportunity to write several items. And it's important that the items be as objective as possible. For example, there shouldn't be 2 different ways to read an item, and that everyone should see it the same way, and that ensures objectivity and standardization. Having written your items, the next step should be ideally to pre-test them. And that again addresses the relevancy of the content, because we intended an item for a particular domain, but if we correlate that item with other questions in that domain and it correlates poorly, then that's an empirical indication that although probably the idea of the item was good, the implementation of it was inadvertently flawed, and that item wouldn't be a great item to include on the exam. And of course, this empirical methodology is objective. Its purpose is to ensure that all of the items are good, and it's a very quantitative process. And then the last step that I'll include here is standard setting. It's important that we set a standard for an exam, like a certification exam that has a passing score. And that standard for passing means a cut score on each form. And the Angoff method, which is the most common method, or the bookmark method for that matter, which is also popular, those are methods of setting the cut score for a standard setting form. And then we use equating to extend that cut score to each form that we create. And that ensures that the objectivity of the passing score, that everybody has a fair shake at passing the exam. And of course, it's a very quantitative process. So that's an overview. And then I've got some slides showing you how psychometrics can affect specific tasks. So, and these are all using Certiverse as an example, but I don't think that it's unique to Certiverse. The first step in a job role analysis is to elicit tasks or knowledge statements or skill statements. Here we're eliciting tasks for a JTA, and I'm in the middle of writing a task like facilitate webinar on psychometrics or something like that. And one of the things that, and I've rehearsed this talk. This next part sounds a little creepy, but one of the things that that you would want your psychometrician to do is sort of review the materials. And the creepy part is that this is like the psychometrician is looking over your shoulder as you type your task and is making recommendations to you. So for example, this is too short, and if you wrote too much and you were including too many things, it would tell you that it was too long, that you should break it up. And it also checks to make sure that the initial word is an action verb. So there isn't a lot of analysis we can do at this point, but there's some best practices, and we try and build them into this system. And you might see that in other systems where a psychometrician has to review the items and recommend changes or something like that. So that's at the beginning of the job analysis. And then all of those statements would be put onto a survey, and a large sample of people would take that survey to help you understand what the relative importance of each statement was, a task statement or a knowledge statement. And here's an analysis of that. Our system will automatically produce this analysis. And what this analysis tells you is that all of these task statements for an entry-level IT are important, but that some of them, like enter commands and observe system functioning, are far more important than others, like develop training materials or confer with staff and others to establish security procedures. And we know that because of the averages that we see in this column that are average importance ratings for the task statements. And our system has a little data cleaning module that automatically runs, and you can tweak it if you don't like the automatic results, that remove people because surveys tend to have this problem. They remove people who answered too quickly, didn't finish, seem to have idiosyncratic rating processes, or didn't have very much variability in their results. And the end result of this is that these criticalities define the blueprint weights. So then we have a blueprint, and this is a pretty typical, simple blueprint. 31% of the exam should be about topic 1. This is now a computer programmer, and 31% should be about debugging, and teamwork is also important, but to a lesser extent. And these numbers, 31% and 11%, came from a fairly simple algorithm based on the JTA output. So those numbers were brought forward from the JTA, and then subject matter experts came in and they looked at these, verified that that makes sense, verified that teamwork seems like it's about a third of the weight of debugging, for example, which seems plausible to me. And then they took a topic and they said, well, 31% is a lot, so let's rationally develop 3 subtopics for that topic, and let's assign them roughly equal weight. And they devised these, and then they added the descriptions. So subject matter experts came and took the initial blueprint, and they fleshed it out and made sure that it was going to be a good blueprint to clear to the item writers so that they could write items about these topics. And the blueprint specifies the number of items. So topic 1.1 here, we would expect 5.5 items. So that means that every form should have 5 or 6 items on that topic, and that across all the forms that are ever created, there should be on average about 5.5 items. And then the system will automatically generate, based on some parameters that you set elsewhere, the item assignments. And we're going to generate 22 item assignments for 1.1 in order that we have plenty of items for a couple forms and some forms left over. So that's what our system does. And I think that's probably similar to the process that most systems are doing. So we generate item assignments proportional to the blueprint. And then it's time to write items, that critical step. And our system has a wizard for doing that. There's lots of different ways that you write items. But the wizard walks you through. First, you go to a screen that shows you the topics. And here for a psychometrician exam, I've chosen topic 2, which is about JTA. And at first you write the question, the stem, and any scenario that the question has. Then you write the key, and then you write the distractors. And then there's some things that you do to finish up. And here I'm in the middle of writing an item about what statistics is and what it's not. There's a long list. If you Google item writing guidelines, the first page and probably the first several pages are all different restatements of Halladina and Downing's 43 rules for writing multiple choice items, the whole page. Those rules are implemented in this system. The syntactical ones are implemented in a way that we can try and catch people as they write the items, and the other ones are embedded in a review process that happens afterward. Like, is the item on topic? That's harder to determine from the syntax of the item. So here we have a indication that we're using negative phrasing and a discouragement from doing that, and a warning to state the stem in the form of a question that's looking for a question mark at the end. So I think that using this type of coaching, there isn't a lot of, aside from those rules, there isn't a lot of psychometrics that we can apply to this absolutely critical step. But I think using this methodology, which is very similar if you think about it, like Word underlining in red a misspelled word, or a word that it can't find in its dictionary, since you can decide whether you need to fix that. And it's not like it has to go off to somebody else, in this case, a psychometrician, to review. You know, if a psychometrician were reviewing this item later and the item was negatively phrased and they wanted to change it to a positive phrasing, the psychometrician probably wouldn't be qualified to do that. They'd have to send it back to the author and say, please phrase this positively. So this way we avoid that loop, and we make the system more efficient. After the analysis, there's after the pre-testing, there's an analysis. This analysis is probably similar to the analysis that you get from most sources. It's convenient that it's baked into the system, and it requires some psychometric knowledge to read this, but these indicate the proportion of people getting the item right, and this indicates the correlation with the total. So these are all fairly good. Probably the items are a little bit hard, and so these would be yellow, and this would probably be green. But through this process, you get a sense of the psychometrics. You still need somebody who's trained, who has some training to read this report. We might try and make that easier, or this might be something that your psychometrician would interpret. And I've got a little video of a new feature we have that will automatically select items for your exam. So you decide which items are available for a form. I'm going to deselect the delivery status, leave the red out, and not allow item enemies. And then you go to the next step, and it's determining whether you have enough items for each of the topics. And we do, although item enemies might still be a problem. There's a little warning about that. And then you go to the next step where it will try and reach a solution where it's picking the exact right number of items. It tells you about the form, the estimated reliability. It shows you that there's no red items on the form, and so on and so forth. And then you can review the items and you can accept the items if you like. So I think this isn't a step that requires a lot of psychometric knowledge, but having it automated makes it a lot easier. And I do think this is a feature that you could conceivably. I've heard of other programs doing this in R, for example, where you have a lot of flexibility to do any kind of system. This particular system, you could call it ATA, automated test assembly, but it is simple. You don't have to set up the problem. It's a canned ATA that just tries to pick a good set of items that adheres to the blueprint, avoiding the items you want to avoid and item enemies. And then finally, the last interface that I have to show you the Angoff study standard setting methodology that we've embedded in the system is somewhat important because there's no way to do an Angoff study without showing your items to a panel of subject matter experts. And using this interface, which is probably similar to other automated interfaces, the items stay in the system. And there's also a little bit of a wizard. For every item, the subject matter expert has to answer the item blind as if they were a test taker. And then there's a step 2 where they review whether or not any of the incorrect responses could be excluded by a minimally qualified candidate. That could produce Nadelsky standards, but I don't think anybody's all that interested in that. But I think it's a good way to think about what's the likelihood that the minimally qualified candidate will get the item right. And then you make that final determination. And one of the perennial problems with an Angoff study is that when your subject matter experts are making those ratings, there can be a tendency for them to inflate this rating. It can turn out that they can overestimate the probability that the minimally qualified candidate will get the item right. And so we provide a little feedback about what their choices are what implications their choices have, which I think is helpful. So those are some ways that psychometrics can help in the specific steps of the exam. So one thing that I'll be very brief about is that none of the things that I've talked about really reduce the role of subject matter experts in the exam development process. Subject matter experts are central to the exam development process today. They will be central to the exam development process tomorrow and in 100 years. In fact, maybe someday we'll have artificial intelligence subject matter experts, but those AI SMEs will still be central to the process. There are so many parts of this process that couldn't go on without subject matter experts. One of our goals in creating the platform was to try and make the work as efficient as possible, but somebody has to, do the JTA. Somebody has to fill out the surveys and write the items and help out in finalizing the form. So the role of subject matter experts is critical. And our role as psychometricians is to ensure that they're working under the appropriate conditions to achieve a good goal. And the last thing that I'd like to talk about is if you had an educational test where you didn't apply psychometric principles, what would you be losing? Or if you have business constraints that don't allow you to use psychometrics. My psychometric, brethren would like me to say that it's the end of the world, But I think that without psychometrics, it's like without that recipe, it's like baking a cake without a recipe. Might be a great cake, but might not, and it might be less consistently good across time. And one thing that we know for sure is that when we do a beta test, we find something between 5% and a larger percentage of the items fail beta testing because they're too hard, or they're tricky, or they have no key, or they have more than one key, or the key that they have is not indicated correctly, or, and this is a big one, they're simply unclear. And because the examinees don't pick up on the main point, they answer in a way that isn't helpful for understanding how much they understand the topic. And having a handful of items like that probably isn't the end of the world, especially miskeyed might be a problem, but especially if they're just unclear. But tricky or miskeyed items are very likely to lead to complaints. And I guess I'd be worried about the possibility that you might have a loss of reputation, that the exam might not seem professionally done if there were too many of those. And finally, you wouldn't have the assurance of defensibility. I think if you use psychometric methods, that you can always defend it. And again, some exams that's very important, and some exams that's less important.